Good evening, another session. He has pushed us to heights, speak with ending individuals, and there's Oprah Winfrey, and this is a speaking to a amputation, looking at his is something which tonight will Lord Peter, who
Best of three. I hope you can hear me now. I'm praying to the Almighty that it's going to work third time round. I'm very pleased that it will, hopefully. Tonight we have an amazing person, amazing guest with us, Lord Peter Levene, who was chairman of Lloyd's of London from 2003 until 2011, the Lord Mayor of London, and so many accolades and outstanding contributions to society that it's almost impossible to encapsulate it in one evening. I'd like to welcome this evening Lord Levene. Lord Levene, are you there?
Yes, Johnny, I'm here. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank the Lord. And you are the Lord as well. So we've got two Lords to thank this evening. And thank you, Peter, for giving your time so freely. And also I'd like to thank Jonathan Metlis for introducing us so that we could have this conversation this evening.
Yes, he and I are usually talking about Chelsea.
Yes, I heard you are a big Chelsea fan.
Yeah, we're doing all right at the moment.
Yeah, you just beat my team, which is Liverpool, so less said the better. But I read your book here. It's Send for Levene, which was actually a phrase coined by Michael Heseltine, as you were the go-to man in those administrations in his era. And I wanted to explore all of that. But having looked at all of your accolades and all of the achievements that you've actually accomplished, I wanted to start really from the beginning. Where did Lord Peter Levene grow up, and what shaped you as a child? I mean, I've read quite a lot here about it. I found it very moving, and the honesty with which you present your early years, particularly. Could you please give us some background information about your family and your upbringing?
Sure. My family, at least my father's family, is relatively unusual because they'd been here since the 18th century. And it wasn't until towards the end of just before the Second World War that they all started to come in from different places around Europe. Some of them had been in at the turn of the century. My mother was born in London, but just about 1908, I think. When I was born, I was born on the day of Pearl Harbor. Now, actually, my birthday is the 8th of December, 1941. Now, the experts will tell you Pearl Harbor was the 7th of December. But in fact, the 7th of December in the Pacific was the 8th of December in Europe. So when I was born, the Americans went to war. I grew up in Pinner, which some people will know. It was more or less out in the countryside at that time. And I stayed there, until we moved back to my parents' original family house, which was in Willesden, in about 46, 47. And I went to school in Cricklewood, used to go on a trolley bus and then a bus to get there. And I suppose it was usual school and family then. And nothing particularly dramatic happened. But I remember well one particular episode, which I haven't forgotten. I must have been about 5 or 6, and I walked across the road from school to catch the trolley bus. And I'd learned to read by then, and there was people had stuck a sticker on the bus stop saying "Kill the Jews." And when I went home, I was worried about this, and I asked my father, and he said, "Oh, well, you see, they've just had this attack on the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, when a lot of British soldiers, officials were killed, and they're blaming it on, unsurprisingly, the Jews." So that was the first example I had of anti-Semitism. But at my prep school, there was none, except that I took the entrance exam for school haberdashers, actually, and was relatively bright and was quite disappointed when I didn't get in, particularly when one of my friends at school, who wasn't very bright, did get in. Now, his name, I remember well, surprisingly, was Cohen, but he didn't profess to be Jewish. And I then learned, my father told me, that they had a very strict quota there. But he said, "Don't worry, you'll try for another school, you'll try for the City of London, it's just as good, if not better." And I did try for that school, and I got a place. And when my father got the letter saying, "You've won a place at the City of London," he said to me, "Now you have the first qualification in due course to become Lord Mayor." Well, now, in fact, that's not strictly true, but he was pretty far-seeing in that, and he never knew that I became Lord Mayor, but that was something I certainly haven't forgotten. So from the City of London, if you ask me what shaped me most, it was probably the 9 or 10 years that I spent there. The teaching was excellent. The school had been set up very much on the basis in the 19th century that they would admit Jews, which was unusual. There was no set religion at the school. We used to have a Jewish service in the mornings, and it was very, in that sense, very liberal, very progressive. Got a good education there, learned to speak languages there, and made a lot of friends, several of whom, my contemporaries, went on to become pretty well known, like Mike Brearley, the cricket captain, Mike Apted, the film producer who sadly just died, Lawrence Collins, who was my exact contemporary, who went on to become one of the first ever solicitor High Court judges, and then went to join the House of Lords as one of the Lord Justices of Appeal. So it was a good grounding.
Fantastic. And I would encourage anyone watching this at home to think of questions to ask Lord Levene. At the end, we'll be taking a bit of a Q&A. So if there's anything that we cover today or we don't cover that you'd like to know more about, please do submit your questions in the chat bar and they'll be filtered through to us here. I guess on that note, regarding your family, I read in the book about your grandfather as well, because you professed a lot of gratitude for how your ancestors had been given opportunities and really had life-saving opportunities.
Well, there's a little card which is shown in the book. If anyone who wants to get the book, you can get it on Amazon, just as a advert today.
Plug.
Plug, yes.
For Jeff Bezos or you, both?
Well, in the book, there's a little card which is really very poignant, which is an appeal that was sent out for funds to support two very, very young children, aged 1 and 3, I think, where the father had died. They're in a large family, they couldn't afford to keep them, and they wanted money. Fortunately, at the end of the day, they found the money themselves. But then my grandfather was brought up at the Norwood Orphanage in the 1880s. And from that, particularly with my father, who never forgot that, my grandfather did well, so did my father. And my father spent a good part of his working life, not just in his own business, but in supporting as it was then, the Norwood Jewish Orphanage. And one of the remarkable things, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but when I first became an alderman in the city, I was in the ward of Portsoken, and that was the Jewish ward. And in fact, at that time, most of the voters were all widowed Jewish ladies who were living there. And I found out to my amazement, which I didn't know until a little later, that my great-great-grandfather was born in the ward of Portsoken. So the history goes back quite a long way. And we were well treated. We were very well treated. But I did think that with some of my ancestors living in pretty poor conditions in the East End, which we all know about, for them to think that they'd have a great-great-grandson who became the Lord Mayor of London would have been pretty unimaginable.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. And in the book, you then talk about your university days and meeting your wife, Wendy, and then launching your business career. Could you expand upon that period of your life?
Well, let's get in the right order. I went to university in Manchester, which probably the furthest north I'd ever been, and found it a wonderfully liberating experience, because the best thing for me about going to university was not living at home anymore during term time. And I took a degree in economics and politics at Manchester, which taught me that study of economics really didn't serve an enormously good purpose. But I spent most of my time there. I was a good athlete, and I was running the athletics club, and then I became captain athletics in Manchester and won the British University Championship. So Manchester was a very happy time. And I would come down, obviously, at the end of term each time, and then where would you go? And I would recommend to anybody who hasn't seen it. I only found it by accident the other day. There's an amazing film you can get on Prime Video about the Green Park Hotel in Bournemouth, and it's an hour-long film, and it shows everything that happened there. And Wendy, my wife, and I saw it and recognized it was the whole environment in which we grew up. You didn't go away at that time on foreign holidays, a bit too exotic. We went to Bournemouth, and you met your partners eventually there. I met Wendy at a charity party in London, and the rest is history. Then, from business, I had no idea what I was going to do. I had the faintest idea after I got my degree. and I'd already met Wendy then. Didn't really know what I was going to do, and I remember even looking up adverts as a driver, which I passed my driving test. But Wendy's father, actually, it was well before we were married, introduced me to someone, and I went into that business, and it developed from there.
And you mentioned quite poignantly you had a dilemma because you were working for one company, but there was an Austrian-based company that came in for you, and then you had a dilemma because you were offered better terms to stay, and the company said you'd behave impeccably because you said that you'd given them your word to move companies and work for them, but because you'd been given better terms, he advised you to do what he did when he was younger and stay where you were.
Exactly. And that company was a company which is now quoted on the stock exchange. They're doing quite different things, called Bunzl. It was set up by Austrian Jewish refugees, and it became one of the biggest pulp and paper companies certainly in Europe. And I had an interview there. They offered me a job. They were going to pay me a lot more money, so I accepted the job. And then my then boss, when I told him I was going, said, "You're not really going, are you?" And I said, "Yes." So he made me an offer I couldn't refuse. But I'm afraid we then fell out. But I stayed there and took over running the business and developed it into something which is pretty sizable.
And that was to do with military operation and armaments.
Well, what it was, I mean, we called ourselves sort of defense in the defense industry, which is really glorified because what we were doing and what he'd been doing for a long time was buying up military surplus. There was a huge amount in the 60s after the war and the forces were running down. And he was buying this stuff and originally selling it all in a shop in Tottenham Court Road and by mail order and selling fairly expected things, telescopes, binoculars and watches. But when he bought all these, they came with them some fairly specialized military items, sighting equipment for tanks and artillery. And in the shop, and you sell these things because they cost virtually nothing. You sell them very cheaply, and then you found out these rather strange foreign people were coming in, buying them, and saying, "You've got any more of these? Can we have 200?" And realized that this military surplus had huge value if it was exported properly. And so he wanted to produce a catalogue which showed everything they had. And that was my job, to produce this catalogue, which I did. And we developed it. And then, as I say, I left the business. He was bought out. The company was floated in 1968, I think. Yes. And we developed it from there.
And then you found yourself in your late 20s traveling the world in this industry. And how did things develop from there, business-wise and in your life?
Well, it was a very small business, but it had turned into a public company, which was a lot easier to do then than it is now. And I traveled the world, met people in different countries, set up agents around the world, and the business developed and developed. And we said we were in the defense industry. We bought first one, then a second one, then a third one, then a fourth one, and a fifth one, factories, initially in the UK. And then we built one in Singapore, which was quite an adventure. Everybody thought we were crazy, but it was a huge success. And then we bought two in America. And so it developed from a company employing 20 or 30 people to one that was employing 5,000 people. And we also had a factory in Egypt, believe it or not.
Wow. But the one very touching moment in the book where you described that Wendy decided to invest some money in shares in the company that you were running. And even though the share value had dropped recently, she had tremendous belief in you and said that if you were running it, she knew what you were doing and you would make it a success. And you were pleased to report that many years later, those shares were worth rather more.
Exactly. I mean, when the company went public, I had to buy some. I didn't have much money. I borrowed money from the bank to buy the shares, and then there was one of the usual stock market crashes, and the shares went to a fraction of what it was. And when Wendy said she wanted to buy some, I said, but I've got nothing to paper the walls with them. They're not worth a bean. She said, no, you'll be okay. Don't worry. And she was right.
Fantastic. So I was wondering whether you could describe how the journey continued then, because when we, I guess that when we summarize the highlights, we talk about Lloyd's of London, Deutsche Bank, and then we talk about the government advisory roles for Michael Heseltine. You were a personal advisor to John Major, the Prime Minister, and all sorts of other projects like the Docklands Light Railway, Canary Wharf. Could you please describe how all of those things unfolded? How did it grow to that? And how did you reach those positions?
Well, by chance, I would say. I mean, I spent just over 20 years building up the business, which became known as United Scientific. And it was doing very well, and we made money, and the company was successful. I said we had about 5,000 people. And our largest factory in the UK was in Taunton, in Somerset. And I would go down there every month. We'd have a board meeting again in the car. And I had bought a car which had in it one of the very first car phones. They're not the car phones like you have now, or the smartphones you just pick up and dial anywhere in the world. Then you had to pick up the receiver, press a button, and hope that an operator might join you, and then try and get connected, and then the phone would often get cut off. But nevertheless, we had one. And one of these trips, I was coming back from Taunton, I had a phone call from my PA who said, look, you had an invitation for lunch. And I said, oh yes, who from? And she said, well, the Defence Secretary, Michael Heseltine. I said, you sure? She said, yes. And he'd asked me to go and have lunch with him. And I thought this was a great honour. I hadn't met any cabinet ministers. And we built up a sort of reasonable reputation in the defence industry as a medium-sized company. And so I went to meet him for lunch, went to the restaurant 1 o'clock as asked. Wasn't there. I went there at 1:15, he wasn't there. 1:25, he wasn't there. I was beginning to think this was a wind-up. But 1:30, sure enough, he turned up. And we had a fascinating conversation over lunch. And he said to me, look, I gather from the people who work for me in the Ministry of Defence, you've built up this business. I don't know anything about the defence industry. I was a publisher. And I get these huge, enormous contracts, millions of pounds put that down on my desk every day. I just have a strange feeling that we're being ripped off. Am I right? And I said, yeah, absolutely, 100%. We did very little business with the British government then, but I knew the industry pretty well. And then we were just finishing the lunch, and I said, well, thank you very much. Most enjoyable lunch. I really enjoyed it. And he said, well, hang on a minute. I didn't just invite you out for a good lunch. I realize you understand this business, so I want you to come and work for me and advise me. And I was very taken aback, and I said, well, I can't possibly do that. He said, why not? And I said, well, because I'm in the industry, it would be quite improper. He said, no, don't worry about that. Come along and see me tomorrow morning. So I went to see him. He had the then permanent secretary, his own Sir Humphrey there, wonderful man called Clive Whitmore with him. And he said, Clive, I've decided to ask Peter Levene to come work with us here. Clive said, well, that won't really be possible, Secretary of State. And he said, just deal with it, will you? So sure enough, I was taken on as an unpaid advisor. And he said, well, we won't give you anything to do with the procurement that you've been used to. I'm going to ask you to go and try and sort out the naval dockyards, Devonport and Rosyth. They've been a terrible mess since the time of Samuel Pepys when he was Secretary of the Admiralty. Everything is delivered late, everything is over cost. Go and have a look at it and see what you can do. So I said, well, I don't really know anything about dockyards, but I'll go and have a look. And first thing I did, I went to the Ministry of Defence and met an admiral who was responsible for the dockyards. And he wasn't all that pleased to see me. And he said, well, what do you want? And I said, well, the Secretary of State asked me to go and have a look at the dockyards. And he said, what for? And I said, well, he wants to see if they can be made more cost effective. Cost effective? Cost effective? What the hell does that mean? So I explained to him, and he looked at me as if I was mad and said, look, we're here to fight the Russians. Now get out of my office and let me get on with some work. So that was my introduction to the dockyards. But over a period of time, went down there, 2 dockyards, one in Devonport, one in Rosyth in Scotland. And we set up what was an American term, a GOCO, government-owned, contractor-operated, which you would, it's not quite privatization, it's a commercialization of the dockyards because they've never been run commercially. I mean, when I was asked them what they were doing there, how they costed the work, and it was always overpriced, and they said, well, we don't cost the work in money. I said, well, how do you cost it? They said, well, we cost it in man hours. So why do you do that? He said, well, it's a totally inflation-proof currency. So I realized that there was quite a lot to do there.
Indeed.
Anyway, I then finished when I left and the dockyards were being taken over by commercial companies. And then Michael Heseltine said to me, you don't really want to go, do you? You like it here? And I said, well, yes, I do. And he said, well, I'm going to ask you to sort out defence procurement. I said, well, you know, it's the one thing I can't do. And he said, you'll have to give up all your shares. You'll have to come here. And it became a huge co-celeb. It was front page news in the papers. And I was going to get paid, I remember, $95,000 a year, which was more than any of the ministers got, or the prime minister. And it was an absolute scandal. And the Labour Party, Neil Kinnock and Gordon Brown, attacked this as the Conservatives looking after their friends, and I was going to be giving contracts to all my friends. And I was supposed to start, I remember, on the 18th of March 1985, and I'd already left my company and said I was going. And then they said, well, we have a bit of a problem in the Ministry of Defence. The Civil Service Commission, who vet all appointments, because I was going in as a grade 1 permanent secretary, a real Sir Humphrey, have refused to approve your move. And I said, well, it puts me in a bit of a mess because I've already left the company. What am I supposed to do? He said, well, we'll try and sort it out. Anyway, this was at the time when Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister. And she and Michael Heseltine were then on good terms, and he spoke to her about taking me on. And she then muscled in on the act on a Thursday afternoon and said, right, I am leaving tomorrow morning to go to Moscow to President Chernenko's funeral. I will be back on Monday. When I come back, Mr. Levene will be installed in his office. Do I make myself clear? And that was how it happened. So I came back, went to the Ministry of Defence. I was running then what was called the procurement executive. Found that I had 36,000 people working for me, which took a bit of getting used to. But they were good. They were very good. And I will always defend the civil service. I remember going to the first day and getting to my private office and saying to them, now look, you know, we've got a lot of work to do. I want everybody in at 8:30 every morning. And they looked at me and said, okay, and what do we do in the first half hour
then? They're already quite on the ball. And then you were appointed as advisor to John Major, presumably.
Well, you're jumping a bit. When I was leaving the Ministry of Defence, I was there for 6 years, which was 2 years longer than I originally intended to be, and got a job in the city. As soon as I went there, I was approached to take on this job as the post which was known as advisor to the Prime Minister on efficiency and effectiveness, which was to look at every government department and try and make them more commercially aware, which was a fascinating job. I had been working for Michael Heseltine, who was by then back in the government, the Department of Environment, and his office phoned me one day and said, look, will you come and see him this afternoon? He needs to talk to you. I said, sure, what about? And he said, well, he wants you to run a railway. And I said, if you mean British Rail, the answer is no. So he said, no, it's not British Rail, it's the Docklands Light Railway. And I said, what the hell's the Docklands Light Railway? Well, of course, we all now know what it is, but it was a bit of a problem at that time. And I think this was something that I got something of a reputation for, sorting out problem areas. The Ministry of Defence, then the Docklands Light Railway, and so we went on. And from the Docklands Light Railway, I met, and you may remember, the Reichman brothers who owned Canary Wharf, which was a brilliant concept, but it got into a lot of trouble, mostly because the transport links didn't work. And I got to know Paul Reichman from running the railway. And after I'd been there for a while, he called me out one day and he said, look, I realized, coming from Canada, I thought I knew how things work in this country, but it's like the United States, it's two countries divided by common language. And he said, I don't know how to operate here. Would you like to come in and run Canary Wharf? And I said, well, it would be very interesting, but from what I've read in the papers, you're about to go bust. And he said, no, we're not about to go bust. Well, sadly, it did go bust about 2 weeks later. And I was then asked by the government to go in and do that job. And that, fortunately, also is another thing that was going wrong. We managed to help sort it out, again, with the help of some excellent people there, one of whom, my closest colleague there, George Jakubescu, is now running it. And it's turned into a huge place, as you know, with 160,000 people. So that's how I got to Canary Wharf, almost by accident, if you like.
May I backtrack to Paul Reichman, because there's a story you mentioned in the book about his Sabbath observance. Of course, Paul was an Orthodox Jew, and wasn't there something to do with Shabbat that?
Well, yes. I mean, he was extremely observant, and so on Friday at dusk, the whole place had to close down, all the construction sites, and so all the staff and all the construction workers were given Friday afternoon off. And they had a lot of problems. And when I went in and inherited his office up there, it's the only office I've ever been in where all the doors had mezuzot on them. They still are, they're still there. And so it was my job. We had to try and turn it around because the company was then in the hands of the banks who owned it. And I said, well, look, this is no longer being run as an Orthodox Jewish company, so we're not going to close down at lunchtime on Friday anymore. At which the building staff complained that they were losing a perk they'd had before and wouldn't carry on until they got it back again. So that was an interesting story.
And that was a classic. And so what happened after that? Because as I mentioned, there was the John Major advisory role. Did that happen soon after then in the 90s? Yes.
But just before, I'll tell you one other interesting story about Paul Reichman. As I say, he was extremely observant. He used to fly backwards and forwards to New York and Toronto with enormous frequency. And he always went on the Concorde when it was running. And then after I'd left the company, I had a phone call from George Jakubescu, who was then running it, and said, look, you've got to help Paul. And I say, why? He said, well, he's sitting on the Concorde. It's Friday afternoon. It's broken down. And they said it can be delayed by about 3 hours. So he can't get back to New York or Toronto in time for Shabbat. I said, well, what do you want me to do? He said, you've got to get him off the plane. He was sitting on the runway. So I made a couple of phone calls, and eventually they sent an ambulance out the plane to deliver him back to the hotel at Heathrow, where he had to spend until Saturday evening. John Major, you asked about. I had been working for Michael Heseltine, And Sir Robin Butler, Lord Butler, who then became the cabinet secretary, I got to know well. And they had this post in the Prime Minister's office, known as the Advisor on Efficiency and Effectiveness. And I was I think the third occupant to that job. And I went into the cabinet office, and then had rather feisty meetings with each of the cabinet ministers in turn to try and see how they could contractualize parts of their business. Some of them were keen, others were not very keen. I remember in particular going to the Home Office, which was then being run by Ken Clarke. And I'd done my homework a little bit before I knew each of these meetings, went to see him, and he said, look, I understand what you're doing. I think this is absolutely the right thing to do. It's a terrific idea. But you must understand that in the Home Office, there's absolutely nothing we can contractualize here. Well, of course, I'd been expecting this, and I said to him, well, what about the prisons? He said, what do you mean the prisons? And I said, well, what do they do in the prisons? They give you accommodation, they need lighting, heating, security, food. Not all that different from a hotel. And was sort of jaw-dropping and horror-struck. They did then privatize some of the prisons, some of which have been a success, others not much so. But it did get us into this business of privatization. And I think that, certainly contractualization, the two companies that came best out of that really built their whole business on that initiative which we were doing. You'll see this little picture, a poster in the book. It was called Competing for Quality. The two companies that really came out of that very well were Serco and it'll come to me in a minute, who built their businesses on the basis of those contractualization programs that we set up.
And what was it like as advisor to John Major?
Very, very interesting. But he was very underrated prime minister. He was a brilliant man. He knew everything that was going on. He would call meetings, and then before the meeting he'd call me and he'd say, now who's coming to the meeting? And I'd tell him, and he said, oh yeah, what's his name? And then when people came in for the meeting, he'd say, oh, Joe, how are you? Fred, how are you? And of course, they well, the Prime Minister knows me, isn't this wonderful? He was a very good man manager in that way. And it was a fascinating opportunity to work with him. And we got quite a lot done. I greatly enjoyed working with him. I think, as I say, I have a lot of admiration for that man, as well as Michael Heseltine, who really built the sort of second half of my career. And whose board I sit on now. He has his publishing company, Haymarket.
And we come towards 1998, and the Lord Mayorship, if that's the right term.
Mayoralty.
I got there in the end. And how did that come about?
Well, when I was still at United Scientific, we bought the company Alvis in Coventry, who were then making armored vehicles. We had a contract to sell those to Malaysia. And the Malaysian Chief of the Defence Staff was coming over to receive the first vehicle. And I went down with him on the train, and with me, they'd invited people because the British Army had been in Malaysia when it was being formed, including the man who was then the sword bearer at the Mansion House, who was a man called John. Anyway, he was talking to me on the coach that we had on the way to see these vehicles, and he said to me, "Look, you went to the City of London School. Why don't you try and become a Common Councilman or an alderman?" And I said, "Well, how can I do that?" And he said, "Would you be interested?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, leave it to me, and I will see how I can help you." So he introduced me to a man called Christopher Lever, who'd recently been Lord Mayor and who he knew well, and who introduced me to his livery company, the Carmen. I then stood for election and Common Council in first in a ward called Candlewick, which is near Cannon Street. We got elected, and immediately after I was elected, the alderman in that ward decided to retire, and so I decided I'd stand as an alderman. Well, to give you the real notion of a rotten borough, at that time, the electorate in the Candlewick ward was 18 people. So I won the election there as a common council. Thought that this was so easy, I didn't have to do anything to win as alderman, and really didn't do enough work. Came to the election. The 18 people all voted. There was 100% turnout. There were 3 candidates. The voting was 7, 6, 5, and I got 6. So it taught me not to be too sure of myself. But soon after that, the vacancy arose. Sir Bernard Whaley-Cohen, who'd been the alderman for the ward of Portsoken, retired, and I stood in his ward, which, as I say, was predominantly the Jewish ward, and got elected there as the alderman. Once you're an alderman, you're then in line to become sheriff if you behave yourself long enough, and then if you behave yourself as sheriff, you may well become Lord Mayor. That's how it happened.
Now, there's a fascinating story about the Lord Chief Rabbi Sachs, or Chief Rabbi Sachs at that time, Oliver Sholem, who was invited to be part of the ceremony which would see you become Lord Mayor. And it was a very, very big honor for the Jewish community to have a Jewish Lord Mayor. And also we know that you had a chaplain in Rabbi Dr. Abraham Levy. And could you tell us a bit about what happened at that ceremony, which also clashed with a Friday night?
Well, it didn't clash with a Friday night. It was on a Friday night. The Lord Mayor always takes office after he's been elected at the Guildhall on a Friday afternoon in November, about 2 o'clock. And I'd had a lot of discussion with people what we were going to do about the Lord Mayor's show, because Rabbi Sachs had said to me, look, you can't have the Lord Mayor's show on Saturday. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but I have to. You can't suddenly change it, disrupt all the traffic in the city. I've been in the Lord Mayor's show for about 15 years. I can't suddenly say I'm so orthodox that I can't travel. So he said, well, could you walk beside the coach? So I said, no, the whole point is having the coach. Anyway, I had 2 chaplains. I had Abraham Levy and I had Church of England chaplain. I had both. And I discussed it with Abraham, as you know, is very wise. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, Peter, you're having the swearing in at the Guildhall on Friday afternoon. It's when it's starting to get dark. Why don't we, after the installation, invite everybody to Bevis Marks to have a Friday night service? And I said, well, that'd be a wonderful idea. And so we set all that up. And then about 2 weeks beforehand, Jonathan Sachs phoned me up and said, look, Peter, do you know what a royal command is? And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, you see, on the night of your service, I've been invited by the Prince of Wales, who's, I think it was his 50th birthday party. 40th, I'm being corrected. And I have to go. So I said, well, how are you going to go? I mean, what are you going to do? And he said, well, I'll go to Buckingham Palace and then I'll come on afterwards to the dinner which you're having, a Shabbat dinner at the Mansion House. I said, well, how will you get there? He said, I'll walk. And I said, well, you know, if you think you should go to Prince of Wales' birthday party rather than come and see the first Jewish Lord Mayor for 40 years sworn in, it's up to you. Anyway, that's what he did. Anyway, the service did take place at Bevis Marks. It was memorable. There were a lot of people there, a large number of whom were not Jewish. And he started asking some questions. And particularly the following day when you were actually sworn in yet again after you've been in the coach in the Lord Mayor's show. The Lord Mayor is then sworn in before the Lord Chief Justice at the Law Courts. And the Lord Mayor is presented to the Lord Chief Justice by the Recorder of London, who's the senior judge at the Old Bailey. Well, it so happened the Recorder at that time was a man called Michael Hyam, and the Lord Chief Justice was Harry Wolff. And Michael Hyam stood up in the law courts and said to the Lord Chief Justice, "My Lord, I think this is probably the first time that a Jewish recorder has presented a Jewish Lord Mayor to a Jewish Lord Chief Justice." And so that's what happened.
Oh, incredible. And I wanted to, we have limited time. We've got a couple of questions from people. And if anyone does have questions, do write in to the chat bar and submit your questions. I do have a few, but I wanted to just show the viewers some interesting photos that I have in your book. Maybe you could comment on them. The first one, which I find unexpected to say the least, is one with you with a certain leader from the Middle East. And just trying to find this photo now. Here we go. Yes, this one is something that I wasn't fully expecting. Here it is. There's you and Yasser Arafat.
Absolutely. When you'll see that above that, there's a picture of me with the president of Lebanon. But you will also note there are pictures there with Yitzhak Rabin, the pictures with Shimon Peres, there are pictures with Asa Weizmann. And of course, as Lord Mayor, although there's a lot of ceremonial involved, the main job of the Lord Mayor is selling the UK. And I had 30 overseas trips planned. And I said, look, the first trip I do, I want to go to Israel. And the Foreign Office said, well, that's all right. But if you go to Israel, you've got to go and visit the Palestinians as well. So I said, well, fair enough. And that's what we did. And that's where we had a rather hilarious meeting with Yasser Arafat, which was quite memorable. But I preferred the meetings with Rabin and with Asa Weizmann, I must say.
Fascinating. And also, one here that should not be ignored is you with Her Majesty Queen. Could you elaborate on this one?
Well, my final, you only have 1 year in office. My final year in office was in 1999. And of course, it was going to be the end of the millennium. And we've been talking about what we might do would be special to celebrate the millennium. And one of my staff in the Mansion House came up with this brilliant idea. Let's have a lunch at the Mansion House, and we will invite the best of British. We will invite, and we're going to call it the Achievers Lunch. Everybody in the UK, in every walk of life, in the city, in industry, in fashion, in newspapers, in politics, in sport. And we'll invite them, representatives from each, to come to the lunch. And I thought that's a great idea. And I spoke to the Queen and said, ma'am, would you be prepared to come to lunch? And she said, yes, I think it's a good idea. I'll come to the lunch, but I don't want to speak. So I said, well, don't worry about that. You won't have to speak. And it was an amazing lunch. I mean, there were so many people there. You would have known every single person who was there, including, we brought over from New York the then 90-year-old Abe Beame, who'd been mayor of New York and was, I think, the one and only born Brit who actually became the mayor of New York. And he came over and stayed with us, which is another story, but I won't bore you with all that. And there was just everybody you could imagine was at the lunch. Ronnie Barker, Ronnie Corbett, John Major, Margaret Thatcher, Nigel Hawthorne, all the sports stars, Fred Truman, you name them, they were there. And it was a great event.
Now we have 10 minutes left, and I wanted to ask you a couple of questions of my own at the end, but one question has come in from my good friend and our mutual friend, Jonathan Metlis, who asks, are politicians less effective by not having business experience. If they don't have business experience, he also says P.S. Osgood was the greatest, but I'll ignore that for
Yes.
now. But
No,
he said,
I would totally agree with that. I mean, I worked primarily for Michael Heseltine, who built up a tremendous business, and he understood exactly what was going on. And there are others of his generation in the cabinet and as ministers who was very easy to work with. But some of the pure politicians just didn't get the business side of it. And I think today we don't see that many senior politicians who've had a good business role. And those who have will be very effective. People like David Young, that's just one example.
another question that's come in is about your family. Someone asks, do you have any children that have followed in any way in your footsteps, or some of them?
Well, we're fortunate we have 3 children. They're all married. One lives in New York, our oldest, who is at Goldman Sachs. Our daughter, who lives in London, who's in PR. And our youngest son, who also lives in London. They have respectively 4, 3, and 3 children. So we have 10 grandchildren. They've all done very well. In terms of following me in one area, my younger son, Tim, was elected to the Court of Common Council, is now chairman of the City of London School, which I was at, which he was at, which his brother was at, and is doing very well in the city, running a fintech business. So certainly there. And my older son is at Goldman Sachs, and my daughter does a very good job in public relations. She used to work for Tim Bell, who was the great guru of public relations. She learned a lot from him, and she's very able.
I spoke at City of London school last week to the Jewish Society there. I do quite a lot of outreach programs at schools.
Yes.
I have to say my interaction with the teachers there and deputy headmaster just emphasized again that it still remains a fantastic school. And I know that some of my congregants' children here in Radlett have been incredibly grateful for the education that their sons have received. So it is a formative place. And
well, I'm still on the board of the school. I have been for more than 20 years, and leaving this summer. But we had funnily enough, we had a board meeting this morning, and it's remarkable. I mean, they've always had outstanding heads there. The current one is extremely good, and the school is extremely liberal. All faiths are there. They teach all faiths. They, whatever they want to do is acceptable, and it's a tremendous education. It's in huge demand now.
Absolutely. And something that I wanted to ask you, Peter, was you've been through it all. You've seen it all. You've seen parts of, I guess, the offices of authority and power that most of us don't get to glimpse at. And you've managed to retain a successful family life, to enjoy grandchildren, to enjoy business, to remain a proud Jew throughout your life. And I wanted to know whether you could tell us maybe 1 or 2 of the main lessons that, if you could impart it briefly, what are maybe a couple of main lessons you've learned in your journey?
Well, I would say various ones. I mean, for example, I found out after a while, if you really want to get to talk to somebody who's fairly senior, people try to go through someone else who thinks they might know them. I found out that the best way to do it is to make a direct approach. You might win, you might not. That's always been my motto. And at the same time, I found that whatever the problem, and I dealt with all sorts of things that I'd never seen before. For example, I ended up at Lloyd's for 9 years. I didn't know very much about the insurance industry. But I found that one of the things I did at university, which I enjoyed, we had a course in logic. And if you look at the basic building blocks of any problem, any situation, and try and reduce it down to the beginning, you can start to find a way to work your way through it. It doesn't always work, but it does usually. And that's something I've always stuck to. Don't make it too complicated.
And in terms of, you mentioned anti-Semitism. I know that you found it seldom in your life. Is that still the case now? And how do you view Jewish identity in 2021?
Well, I mean, the situation has changed, obviously, since I was born, primarily because of the establishment of the State of Israel. And too much anti-Semitism now gets mixed up with anti-Zionism and people who hate Jews because they think they're oppressing the Muslims. I have to say, when I went to Israel as Lord Mayor and went to meet with the Palestinians, you do then start to see both sides of the story. But I've always been a very proud Jew and have supported Jewish causes. And the only time, and people may find this hard to believe, in the government, the Ministry of Defence and the House of Lords and Lloyds usually say, well, there must be quite a lot of anti-Semites around. Well, I'm not blind, and I didn't see them. The only time I found it was just once, when I was Lord Mayor, and the speechwriter, because you had to make something like 800 speeches during the year, the speechwriter had sent me down the speech, and on it was scribbled some notes from one of the assistant private secretaries there, which I realized as soon as I looked at it was aimed at me and was vilely anti-Semitic. And the guy who wrote it, of course I wasn't supposed to see it, I called him down and I said, did you write this? And he said, yes. Does it mean what I think it means? He said, yes. I said, well, you're fired. And that was the only time I've ever experienced it. And today, you know, I don't see it. I mean, of course it's around. I mean, there's people who don't like all sorts of different types of other races or religions, but it's never been a hindrance to me, and I've never tried to hide it.
I think that's very important for the next generation to hear that it doesn't have to be a hindrance, and that I think your story in terms of Jewish identity is one where there is no victimhood. It's been about ingenuity, progress, contribution, which I think is a very wholesome and inspiring theme of your life, which I think is powerful. It comes through in the book, certainly, and it comes through speaking to you. And again, we've reached 9 o'clock now, so we've had our hour, but it's really been a fascinating talk. I wanted again to thank you, Lord Levene, for your time, for your honesty, and for letting us get to know you a bit better. And what I do sense more than anything else is the wisdom of that experience that can inform a new generation.
Well, thanks. You're very welcome. It's a pleasure. I'm very happy to have done it for you.
Well, on behalf of the United Synagogue, because this is US in the City, which began pre-pandemic as me basically going off to offices in the City of London, many different offices and places, Bank of England, Treasury, other government offices, as well as private firms, has now morphed and adapted and evolved through this pandemic, going online and speaking to wonderful personalities such as yourself. So very grateful for all of that. And I hope that everyone enjoyed it at home watching. And so, Lord Peter Levene, thank you so much and good night.
Thank you.
All the best.